Whether you're buying a computer for someone or just getting the parts to do it yourself, you need to know the basics. Intel or AMD, Nvidia or AMD, how much RAM do I need? What are all those motherboard numbers? NVMe? What even is that? Don't worry, over the course of this video, I'll do my best to make sure that buying parts and putting together a PC is a painless experience. For the sake of simplicity, I've gathered what I think are the best bang for your buck PC parts. It's not going to be the most amazing PC ever, but I guarantee you that this PC won't disappoint whether you're flossing on noobs in Fortnite or editing clips of you flossing on noobs in Fortnite. So the first thing you're going to want to decide is what processor you're going to be going with. You'll have the choice of two brands, Intel or AMD. The stigma around these is that Intel is the more refined choice, and up until recently, it was the runaway best choice. AMD has made a resurgence in the last few years, and honestly, both make great chips. When shopping for a CPU, you'll come across plenty of different models from both sides. Luckily, they follow somewhat similar naming conventions in that the 1000th digit is going to be the generation of the processor, and the following digits will reflect the SKU within that gen. Then you'll sometimes see a letter at the end. Higher 1000th digit is newer, and higher 100th digit is more powerful. Then the letter means different things for each brand. For Intel, a K means it's unlocked and can be overclocked to get more power. An F means that there's no built-in graphics, so you'll need a GPU to get any video out. And an S means it's a specialty bin chip and should perform super well. For AMD, an X means it's a bit more powerful, and G means it has built-in graphics. All AMD chips are unlocked and can be overclocked. One important thing to note is that as of the 7000 series, all AMD chips have built-in graphics, but anything before that won't, unless it has the G letter. That doesn't matter as long as you have a graphics card though. The two main things you'll want to look for in terms of specs are the core count and the frequency. Modern chips range from 4 cores all the way up to 16 cores plus, with various levels of thread counts per core on the Intel side. Frequency is how fast each core can run. The higher, the better. These numbers aren't the end-all be-all, because there are other factors like IPS and TDP, but that's outside the scope of this video. I ended up going with an Intel i5-12600K. It was on sale for under $200 and has 10 cores and 16 threads, with a boost clock of 4.9 gigahertz. It's plenty. It was a close call between this one and the AMD Ryzen 5600X. Both are great, but I think at the same price, the 12600K is a better buy. Once you choose your CPU, you'll then decide on a motherboard. Just like before, there are Intel chipset motherboards and AMD chipset motherboards. Obviously, you'll go with the chipset based on which processor you picked. Again, Intel and AMD have similar model numbers when it comes to chipsets. It'll be a letter followed by a 3-digit number. For Intel, there are 5 different ones, but you only have to know 3. H, B, and Z. These increase in features and price in that order, with H being the lowest budget option, B being the middle ground, and Z being the top tier. Each will have different kinds of features like faster LAN ports, more NVMe slots, better power delivery, etc. The main thing to note is that for the most part, a Z series board will allow you to overclock your K series processor, while the others don't. And the 3 digits after the letter, you'll only really care about the first number, which is the generation. It would be nice if you just had to match up the generation of the motherboard with the CPU, but it's not like that. To find out which generation of CPU your motherboard can support, you'll have to look it up. In some cases, you'll see a letter at the end too. This denotes the size. Motherboards generally come in 3 sizes: Mini ITX with a single PCIe slot, Micro ATX with 4 PCIe slots, and ATX with 6 or 7. In our case, we went with an ASRock B660M, so it'd be a mid-tier 600 gen Micro ATX board, but there's something weird about the motherboard CPU combo we chose. I'll play Dora the Explorer and see if you can notice what it is. That's right, we have a B series board with a K series chip, meaning that the CPU is overclockable, but the motherboard won't allow it. Why did I do this? Honestly, price. When I was shopping around, the K series chip was cheaper than its non-K sibling. In this case, if you don't go with a Z series board, then just go with the cheaper option between the K and the non-K, or the F model, since we will be installing a GPU. AMD follows a similar theme, so I'm not going to walk through that. Just look at this graphic. You'll also see another number/model when looking at motherboards. For ours, we see LGA 1700, which denotes the physical size of the socket that the CPU goes in. For the most part, you don't have to worry about this, assuming your processor and motherboard chipset are compatible, but there are a few odd cases out there, so just make sure that they match up. AMD uses AM3, AM4, AM5, so look for that if you are going with Team Red. Our motherboard of choice has all the creature comforts that we need, especially at under $100. We get DDR4 RAM, 3 PCIe slots, 2 of those being full 16X slots, 2 NVMe slots, and M.2 for a Wi-Fi card. We also get 4 SATA ports and, of course, RGB. Now, this might not make sense, but it will soon. After this, we get to choose our RAM. Come here. In today's times, the minimum I would go with is 16 gigabytes. We're going to focus on 3 things when we choose RAM: the amount of slots our motherboard has, the type it supports, and the speed. Our motherboard has 4 slots, so we can either go with 2 or 4 sticks. You can do an odd number, but most motherboards operate in dual channel mode, so multiples of 2 are going to be much better. As for type, our board supports DDR4, so we need to make sure we go with DDR4. Very rarely when browsing for RAM, you may see ECC. This is server RAM and won't work in consumer boards, so don't get that. Now, speed. You'll see our board advertises that it supports 4800 megahertz. This essentially means that this is the fastest speed that it'll happily support. But any DDR4 RAM will work in here. I chose to go with 2 16GB sticks of Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro 3600 megahertz, giving us 32 gigabytes total with room to add more down the road if we need it. For the most part, RAM is the most forgiving part of the build because as long as you go with the right type, you'll be fine. There are plenty more nuances to RAM like the cache latency and the voltages, but for this video, it doesn't matter. Okay, the next thing we are going to choose is probably the most important if you're a gamer, and that is our GPU. This might also be the most expensive part of the build, as you can snag new cards that range from $200 up to well over $2,000. There are 2 main brands for GPUs, NVIDIA and AMD. Yes, that same AMD that makes CPUs. Now, Intel does make GPUs, but at the time of making this video, shouldn't really go with them. If you're watching this video in like 2030 or something and Intel has taken over the GPU market, cool. Generally, any GPU will work in any computer, so it really comes down to how much you want to spend versus how much you actually need. As you go up in price, there are serious diminishing returns. So for this build, I wanted to choose between an AMD 6700 XT and an NVIDIA RTX 3060. Both are mid-tier cards. Similar naming conventions to the processors, with the thousands digit being the generation and the following number being the tier. I could honestly spend a long time discussing the differences between various cards and the features you get with each brand. But honestly, the best way is to pick some games you play and Google benchmarks for that game with each card. A higher FPS is better, but as long as you see around 60 or above, then you're good. I'm going to go with the 6700 XT just to give AMD some love. Moving on, we need to power this thing. How do I want to do this? Power supplies are pretty straightforward. Obviously, you want to ensure that you have enough power. You can calculate this by looking at the TDP of your CPU and the power draw of your GPU. I usually add a bit to the TDP just to play it safe. For a 12600K and the RX 6700 XT, it's recommended we go with something around 400 watts. I went a little above that and went with a 650 watt unit from Corsair. Outside of the watts, you'll want to check for 2 things. One is that you have the right amount of cables to power your CPU and GPU. Some motherboards will have more than just the normal 8-pin connector, but this is more commonly found on higher tier boards. And your GPU should have a 6-pin, 8-pin, dual 8-pin, or even a triple 8-pin. But I checked to make sure everything was fine before going with this unit. Then there's the 80+ rating. It comes in a tier of flavors from white up to platinum. This denotes the efficiency of the unit and usually it's price. Ours is 80 plus bronze, which is perfectly fine for this build. All right, only a few more parts left, one of which is our CPU cooler. Bro, I'm getting tired of shuffling these things around. Depending on what processor you go with, you might have a cooler included in the box, but these days they kind of stopped doing that for high tier chips since the crappy coolers that they included weren't even good enough to cool the processor. The only thing you really have to worry about here is the socket that we mentioned earlier. CPU coolers often fit plenty of different sockets, so as long as it's compatible, then you're good. There are also two styles you can go with, air cooling or an AIO, or all-in-one water cooling. Honestly, it just comes down to preference. Air cooling has gotten so good that there's usually not much of a difference between them and AIOs. I'd recommend just finding one that looks good and doesn't have like -3 stars on Amazon. I went with this Vetro unit because it's cheap, it looks good, and from previous experience, I know that it performs well. All right, storage. Ooh. This is another one of those things that I could spend a long time on, but I'm going to try to simplify it. You're going to want to go with a solid state drive to install your operating system on, and a hard disk drive if you have the need for a ton of space. Under the solid state umbrella, we have two form factors and two protocols. Physically, you can choose between M.2 drives, which look like little sticks of gum, or a 2.5-inch drive that looks like, well, this. Then you can choose between SATA and NVMe. This is where it gets a little complicated, so I'll try my best. The SATA protocol is the same one used by your hard disk drives, and while a SATA SSD will be much faster than a hard drive, it's not nearly as fast as an NVMe drive. But SATA drives can also come in the M.2 form factor, so watch out. Just because it looks like a stick of gum doesn't mean that it's a super fast NVMe drive. Generally, you'll want NVMe drives for your boot drive, and for extra storage, you can go with more NVMe or some cheaper SATA SSDs or hard drives. I went with a single 1 terabyte Samsung 980 Pro NVMe drive. You'll see all kinds of speeds advertised and different PCIe generations and SLC versus TLC versus QLC, but we're not going to worry about any of that. Okay, last but not least, our case. This is pretty much only limited by the size of the parts you chose. If you went with a mini ITX board, a small GPU, and a slim AIO, then you could get something itty bitty, but if you got some chonkers, then you'll obviously need something bigger. Our parts are pretty standard, so I went with a mid-tower case with 4 PCIe slots to match our motherboard. This is a Sama case, which comes with 4 RGB fans, has a tempered glass side, and I think looks pretty decent. And for 80 bucks, I'm not complaining. I know all of that may have seemed either extremely overkill or extremely brief, but I wanted to cover all the things I wish I knew when getting into building PCs without diving too far into the weeds. But enough talking about all these parts, let's put it together. All right, the first thing we are going to be working with is the motherboard, so everything else can go on the floor. Okay, put everything aside, all the extra goodies, screws, cables. We need this. And usually the best way to do this is to just put the motherboard on the box. It's not conductive, gives you a nice working space. Yeah, a little tour of the motherboard. We have our 8-pin power at the top, 24-pin on the side, our 4 RAM slots, our CPU socket, our chipset, 1 NVMe slot, 2 NVMe slot, an M.2 for Wi-Fi, our PCIe slots, front panel headers, USB, 2 SATA slots, and a fan and RGB all around the board. So what we're going to do first is install our processor. Do not remove this little cover until you're absolutely ready to put the chip in, because there's pins, and if you bend any of those, you're in trouble. All right, so how this is going to work is you'll normally see a little triangle on the corner of your socket. It's noted right here, and you'll line that up with the corner that the triangle is on your processor. Now it's pretty small, but if you look closely, you can see it. So I'm just going to orient it so that I know it goes in like this. To get this cover off, just push down on this little lever arm, move it aside and it should spring up. And then you can just lift it out of place. This comes up and you'll see all those little pins. Be very careful. Do not bend those. Just take your processor, line it up, and it should fit right on. Very easy. Then in reverse, push this down, push the lever down, and tuck it under. It will give a little bit of resistance. You will have to apply some force. Don't worry. The next step is the RAM. Now we have 2 sticks and 4 slots, and you could just put them in any slots and they'll work, but for optimal performance, you'll want to consult the motherboard manual, but for the most part, you'll start at the end and skip a slot. So we are going to start at the end. We are going to push these tabs back. Some motherboards require you to push both back, some just one. In our case, it's just one. And then you'll line this little slit in the RAM up with the slit in the motherboard. It does look like it's in the middle, but it's slightly offset. So make sure that slot is correct. And this is backwards, so I'm going to flip it. And that should be good. So you'll just slide it in and then push equally on both sides. And it should clip right in. Same thing for your second one. Now we are going to do our NVMe drive. So we do have 2 slots. One is a PCI 4.0 slot. One is a PCI 3.0 slot. I believe this is a 4.0 card. Yes, so we will install it in the 4.0 slot. Generally, that's obviously how you'll want to do it. But if you install it in a 3.0 slot, you'll be fine. So this is going to require a smaller screwdriver. Now that the heatsink's off, you can see the slot exposed, which is identical to this one. What you'll do is line the slit up with the one on the port, insert it at a bit of an angle, and then push it down. You'll see it should line up with this standoff. We'll put this back on top. Actually, haha. So when you have these heat sinks, a lot of the time they will have a thermal pad on the back, which is covered by this tape. So make sure you peel that off. And NVMe drives are awesome, not only because they're super fast, but how easy and clean they are to install. Like, that's it. Okay, the last thing we're going to want to do is install our CPU cooler. Now, we have an air cooler, so it should be relatively easy. If you have an AIO, it can be a little bit tricky because you'll have to install the block and then the radiator separately, but our case should be pretty easy. Okay, first things first. Pretty much all of your CPU coolers are going to come with a bag with various mounting brackets for either AMD or Intel and different sockets. We have one that says Intel and one that says AMD. Guess which one we're using. We got some fan clips to secure the fan to the heat fins, some thermal paste, and some screws. I think I should be able to figure this out. And this piece is going to be our back piece that connects to the back of our motherboard and goes in through these 4 little screw holes and lets us mount the cooler directly to the motherboard. So if you look at this back piece, you'll see that the end clips actually have numbers on them. You'll see 115X and 17XX. That is the socket. So I'm assuming you just set it to the socket, which ours is 1700. And now what we'll want to do, I think this is actually a piece of tape. So some of these have this tape that'll help this stick to the back of your motherboard. You'll want to remove that and you'll flip the board over. Could have done this before installing the RAM, but we'll be okay. And we'll make sure everything is lined up, which it should be. Okay, now we're in. So there will be some give, but luckily we have that tape. So when we flip it back over, it won't fall off. Now we can bust out our mounting brackets. So the way these are going to work is that they're going to screw directly onto the cooler right here and then screw into the mounting bracket we installed on the motherboard. Okay, and the last step before mounting it is to install our thermal paste. And this stuff exists because while your CPU looks pretty flat and the bottom of your cooler looks pretty flat, there are some tiny little microscopic gaps, and the thermal paste just acts as a way to bridge those so that you get full contact from your cooler to your processor. So what we're going to do is add a tiny little amount, like the size of a pea, right in the middle. You can do a little line, you can do a blob, that's plenty. Some people put it on there and then spread it out with a piece of plastic or something, but when I push this down, it's going to spread itself. Our V is in the right orientation. Put it right on top, and you're going to screw these down, and don't go all the way immediately. You'll want to make sure the screw catches a little bit, which it is. Then we'll switch to the diagonal. This just make sure you have even pressure across the board. You don't want to ratchet one side all the way down. You want it to be nice and even. Now we can screw it all the way back to the corner. Okay, it is on there. Boom. Okay, now we can install the fan. That is the last part of this. Now, you'll see a couple of cables coming off of it. If you have RGB, you'll have two. If it's not RGB, you'll just have a single one to power the fan. The first thing you want to do is locate where you actually want to plug this in. Now, there's usually plugs at the top. You can see we have one labeled CPU fan 1. That's where we'll plug in the power, and then we'll need an RGB plug. It looks like we have two of them here. Both of these are addressable. There are two types of RGB, addressable and non-addressable. They are not interchangeable. One uses 12 volts, one uses 5. So we want our cables to point in that direction, and we want the airflow to go towards the back of the motherboard. And in special cases, you may want it differently, but for the most part, you'll want air coming in from the front or bottom and out through the top or back. So we'll keep with that airflow and make sure it's coming in from the front and exhausting to the rear. And these fans have a little arrow showing you, but if you look at the fan blades, they will flow in the direction of the cup. So if you make a little cup with your hand, that's how you'd scoop. That's the way that the air moves. So we're gonna need these clips. So you'll wanna put it in place. And the way these work is that these little hooks hook on to the inside of these little screw holes. And then this part of the clip goes around the side of the cooler. Okay, and these ones look like they actually go on this one. And then boom, you just kind of clip on. Pretty easy. If I turn it on side, you can see how that actually works. They're clipped in here, and then this part is clipped on the side of these fins. You can either plug these in now or wait till you do the rest of the cable management and stuff, but we'll leave them unplugged for now. And the next step is to deal with our case. So let's put this aside and work with the big chungus. Okay. So first thing is to take off the side panel. Depending on which case you get, that'll be vastly different, but this one has two screws in the back, and then the side should slide out like so. And in here, they'll usually hide a box of screws or mounting brackets or whatever. Ours is right here. Okay. Probably gonna be a bunch of cables. Don't worry about it. The reason we have so many is that there's actually fans already installed. But that was gonna be my next step. If you have case fans, which you should, whether they're included or not, you'll wanna set up a configuration. Now, this looks pretty good. We have 3 in the front, bringing air in. Then we have 1 in the back doing exhaust. Generally, you'll want it to be even, but this is okay. But our fan configuration looks fine. What you'll want to do is if you have any other hard drives that you want to install, like if you're installing another SSD or a hard drive, you'll want to get those installed first. It just makes things easier for when you do cable management later. So ours looks like it has a bracket. A lot of these cases do a little SSD bracket where you can just screw it directly to here, comes off, screw it on, and you're free to run your cables later. If you have a hard drive, they usually go underneath here, but obviously all cases are different. Just consult the manual and you'll see how to mount your drives. But we're sticking with just NVMe, so I'm not throwing it. Okay, now we're going to install the power supply. Actually, remember this thing? This IO shield? Let's install that. So some newer motherboards actually have the IO shield built into the actual motherboard, and you don't have to worry about cutting your fingers open trying to get this in. But what this does is it goes from the inside right here on this slot, and you'll want to make sure it's in the right orientation, audio at the bottom, and with the appropriate amount of pressure, be able to clip in all the corners. Looks like we're good. Okay, so our unit here is a semi-modular power supply, meaning that the 24 pin and the 8 pin are directly connected, but everything else is modular. So if you don't need things, you don't have to plug them in and they won't get in the way. So let's worry about those later. We're going to get this installed first. Actually, no, we are going to plug these in because it's easier to plug them in now than it is when it's in the case. So looking here, we are going to need, it looks like a single PCIe connector for our GPU. If you look at the cable here marked PCIe for our GPU, one end goes into the motherboard or power supply, and the others go into the GPU. And you can see we have two 8-pin plugs. A lot of the times there'll be 6 with this little 2-piece because some GPUs have 6-pin. We have dual 8s. That's where our GPU takes. We only need one plug. And honestly, that's the only one we need. If we were running hard drives or SATA SSDs, we would have to use the SATA or peripherals one, but we're not. And we're going to put this in on the backside going in from the inside of the case, and the orientation will depend on your airflow. So generally, you'll want the fan at the bottom if you have room for airflow at the bottom. If it's a solid bottom, then you'll want this on top. So we have airflow vents at the bottom, meaning it'll go in just like that. Sorry, I had to turn it so I could see where the screws go. Building a PC and have it facing the camera at the same time is difficult. And what we'll want to do now is roughly run where our cables are going to go, especially our 8-pin. You'll see why in a bit. So find our 8-pin CPU connector labeled CPU. And remember, it goes at the top of the motherboard, so there should be a slot up here to run it. And then 24-pin is on the side of the motherboard. We're going to run it through here. And then for the graphics card, depends on your case, but just route it somewhere that can reach your graphics card. So it looks like we have some holes right here that should come up directly by our GPU. So let's try there. And the reason we do this now is because once everything's in here, it can be a huge pain to run cables. And now we are ready to install the motherboard. And the way the motherboard attaches to the case is on these standoffs. Some have standoffs already installed in the case, some don't, and depending on your motherboard, you may need to add some more. And we'll do an eyeball check. So I think there's usually like 9 screws depending on the size. So we have 1, 2, 3 at the top, 3 in the middle, and 2 on the bottom. So a total of 8. Yep, everything is already set for us. Pretty easy, but if they aren't, you'll usually have a bag of screws included with your case that does have standoffs ready to be installed. All right, and this part's relatively easy. Lower it down onto the standoffs and make sure you gently slide it so that everything lines up nicely with your back I/O shield. You don't want to be sliding this thing across the metal of those standoffs because the back of your motherboard can be very delicate. And to screw these down, we're going to get our bag of screws that came with our case. And now you can see why we wanted to run the power cables first, because it's a lot easier to just connect them now than it is to run everything. And especially in smaller cases, this one can be an absolute pain to get to. Okay, everything's looking good. We're actually almost done. We just got to plug stuff in. We are going to start with the front panel connectors. So your case will usually have buttons and ports on it, and the way you get those to work is that you have to connect them to the motherboard. So depending on the ports you have, will determine what connectors you have to use. So let's go ahead and get those installed. Let's start with the worst one, the USB. The connector for that is on the side right under the 24 pin. And then line the notch up, bend it, and plug it. I guess while we're here, we'll do the 24 pin. Okay. Next, we'll do our front panel, and it's kind of hard to see, but these are the front panel connectors. You can see they're labeled. You'll just line it up with the plugs and plug those in. The footage of this isn't going to be great, so just use your imagination. Dude, this freaking power supply smells like butts. Neat. HD audio, which is usually in the back in the worst possible spot. Honestly, you don't have to use this if you're not going to use the audio on the case, but we will plug it in. Voila. Now, in some cases, it's actually really hard to get to, so you may want to fish that plug through and plug it into your motherboard before you even put the motherboard into the case. Okay, last step is fans. Now let's start with our CPU fan. Remember, we are plugging the power right here in our CPU fan header, and it looks like there's an adjustable plug here, so we will just use that. And we do have a daisy chain plug as well here that we can use for our case fans, which are already routed on the back here. So let's take a look. Yep, everything looks like it's already plugged in. Oh no. Well, that's unfortunate. So these fans don't connect into the motherboard to control the speed. I saw this Molex connector, which is like an old school connector that absolutely sucks and I hate it. But this goes directly to your power supply, meaning that we'll have to bust out the pack of cables and get a Molex one. So yeah, I thought these fans were going to be both addressable RGB and PWM, meaning that I could control both the RGB and the speed of the fans from the motherboard. They are neither. It's a proprietary RGB connection here and just standard Molex power for the fans, meaning that we have to run another cable from the power supply using the Molex connector to make sure our fans have power. Plug this guy in, voila. Everything else is essentially plugged in. Now we can do our cable management. Now your level of cable management may vary. If you don't care, you can literally just smush everything down and put the back panel on top, but we'll try to tidy it up a little bit. And I'm going to assume you guys know how to use zip ties. Okay, decent. These are just gonna get tucked out of the way. All right, is this the best cable management job ever? Probably not, but it gets the job done and helps to prevent cables from being seen. Okay, we are done back here. We can install our graphics card. Now, 99% of the time, you'll want to use your top PCIe slot, and you'll go 2 down depending on how fat your card is. Ours is a 2 height slot, so we need to remove 2 of these PCIe covers. And you'll go ahead, line up your GPU, boom. We're in. Screw it back in place and connect your power. Okay, and there you have it. It is done. Now we plug it in and see if it works. Okay, for video out, make sure you plug your HDMI or DisplayPort into the actual graphics card. This may sound silly, but I've seen it actually plenty of times where parents build a PC or get a PC for their kid, or someone buys a PC they don't know much about. They'll see the HDMI or DisplayPort on the motherboard and just use that. If you do that, your GPU isn't getting used at all. Make sure it's plugged into the GPU. Then we'll plug in power. What are the odds this works? I mean, it should be high, right? This is a tutorial video. 3, 2, 1. Ooh, okay. We have a post, baby. Let's go. Okay, so once you're in here, let me show you the one thing you need to make sure you need to do. Okay, apparently my recording got messed up, but all I was saying is that the one thing you're going to want to make sure to do is go into the BIOS and enable XMP for your memory profile. This will allow your RAM to run at its rated speed rather than at the base frequency. Now, if you don't do this, you may not notice, but if you want to get what you paid for, then make sure that is set. Now, overall, I think this PC is freaking awesome, especially for the price and what we got. It's fast, it games really well, no matter if you're running something easy like League of Legends or something extremely demanding like Cyberpunk 2077. It's also a solid little workstation for content creation. And of course it looks good and it's upgradable if you want to keep this same system down the line. So yeah, that's it. I hope you learned something today. I hope this helps some of you out there. I know a lot of you that watch my channel are already experts and know a lot of this stuff, but I wanted to put something out there to maybe help those who are just getting into PCs and maybe want to build one of their own. But if it did, then go ahead and drop a like. If you want to see more tech content, then go ahead and subscribe. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube members and my Patreons. You guys are my PC that I built with my own soft, bare hands. You guys are awesome. And if you're still watching, you're cool too. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.